I thought buying a quiet home in the valley meant peace, fresh air, and freedom. Instead, the day I returned to my cabin, I was met with fury. The HOA president, who everyone called Karen, stormed into my driveway, shouting like I was trespassing on my own land. She had no idea the truth. I wasn't just a homeowner here. I owned the entire valley she claimed to control. What happened next sparked a fight that would shake the entire community and expose just how far an HOA will go when their power is threatened. So ask yourself, who really held control here? When I first bought the cabin in the valley, I wasn't chasing luxury or status. I wanted quiet mornings, crisp mountain air, and nights where the only sound was the wind in the trees. For years, this place had been my escape from the noise of city life. It wasn't glamorous, just a modest wooden cabin tucked at the base of the ridge, but it was mine. And more importantly, the valley around it was mine, too. What I didn't know at the time was that this ownership would one day become the spark for a battle I never saw coming. The valley wasn't empty. Families had slowly moved in over the years, building homes along the riverbank and scattering houses up the hillside. First, I welcomed the company. I watched kids ride bikes past my gate, neighbors host barbecues on summer weekends, and people wave politely when I drove by. For a while, it felt like a community, a quiet, friendly corner of the world where everyone looked out for each other. But as more homes popped up, a new force came with them, an HOA. It started small, with promises of keeping the neighborhood clean and protecting property values. On paper, it sounded harmless. They installed signs, sent out newsletters, and reminded people to keep their lawns trimmed. I didn't pay it much attention. After all, I'd been here long before they were even organized. My land, my cabin, my rules. At least that's what I thought. At first, the signs of trouble were small, so small I almost ignored them. A letter tucked into my mailbox, no signature, just the HOA's stamp at the top. Unapproved modifications on property. It read. The so-called modification? A stack of chopped firewood neatly piled behind my cabin, exactly where I'd always kept it. Apparently, the HOA board had decided the woodpile was unsightly. Their demand, move it out of view or face a fine. I laughed when I read it. A firewood stack, hidden behind trees, was suddenly a problem? I crumpled the paper and tossed it aside, assuming they'd move on. But that was their opening move, and it wouldn't be their last. A week later, another notice arrived. This one claiming my driveway gravel didn't meet community standards. I'd had that same gravel for years, long before most of the houses were even built. The fine, $200. Again, I ignored it. Surely, they'd realize their mistake once I reminded them I wasn't under their jurisdiction. But the notices kept coming, each more absurd than the last. My cabin paint was too rustic. My fence was non-compliant. And even the wildflowers that had grown naturally for decades were now deemed unapproved landscaping. It became clear, this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Neighbors started to change, too. People I once chatted with at the mailbox now looked nervous when they saw me. One neighbor whispered that the HOA president, Karen, had been telling people I was a problem resident who refused to respect the community. Another warned me that Karen had bragged about getting rid of the cabin eyesore if it took all year. One night, I caught Karen's SUV parked across from my cabin, headlights off, engine idling. She sat there for nearly an hour watching. I stepped onto my porch, arms crossed, and stared back until she finally drove away. But the message was clear. She wanted me gone, and she wasn't stopping. I decided to push back. I showed up at an HOA meeting, my first one ever. The moment I walked into that living room, the air turned heavy. Karen sat at the head of the table like a queen on a throne, a stack of binders at her side. The neighbors sat stiffly, eyes down, as she rattled off violations. When she got to my name, her voice dripped with venom. Non-compliant property maintenance, unapproved landscaping, unsafe fencing, multiple unpaid fines. I raised my hand, steady but firm. Excuse me, but I don't answer to the HOA. My property predates this association. And more importantly, I paused, letting the silence fall heavy. I own the land under several of these homes, including yours, Karen. The room shifted. A few neighbors gasped, but Karen didn't flinch. She just smiled, thin and cold, and said, "Ownership doesn't excuse negligence. We'll pursue this through every channel available." That was the moment I realized. This wasn't just a dispute. It was war. The harassment escalated overnight. I woke up to spray paint across my fence. "Pay your fines." My mailbox was smashed. Trash bags mysteriously appeared on my property, followed by anonymous complaints that I wasn't keeping things clean. It was a cycle designed to break me down. Create the problem, then fine me for it. I thought about giving in, moving the woodpile, paying a token fine just to end the circus. But deep down, I knew that giving her an inch would mean losing everything. Karen didn't want compliance. She wanted victory. So I dug in. I started documenting everything: photos, dates, times, every ridiculous notice they sent. I researched property law, digging up my original deeds that proved I wasn't under HOA control. And the deeper I dug, the more shocking it became. Many of the HOA's rules weren't just unfair, they weren't even legal. Karen had been inventing violations, inflating fines, and bullying anyone too afraid to push back. One evening, I returned from town to find something waiting for me in the driveway. My firewood pile, once neatly stacked, had been scattered across the gravel, logs rolling into the road. On top of the mess sat a fresh notice taped to a splintered piece of wood. "Final warning. Remove all unauthorized materials or further action will be taken." It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was sabotage. I stood there in the fading light, holding that crumpled notice, and realized the fight had reached a point of no return. This wasn't about wood piles, fences, or gravel. It was about power, and whether one person could bully an entire community into submission. Karen thought she had me cornered. She thought the weight of fines, gossip, and intimidation would finally break me. But what she didn't know was that I had been preparing my move, quietly, carefully, while she reveled in her false victories. I called a meeting, not an HOA meeting, my own. I invited every homeowner in the valley, not with threats or mandates, but with a simple message slipped into mailboxes. If you've ever felt targeted, pressured, or unfairly fined by the HOA, you'll want to hear this. The night of the gathering, my cabin glowed with lamplight as neighbors filed in one by one. Some came cautiously, glancing over their shoulders, as if Karen herself might catch them. Others came eagerly, faces tight with frustration they'd held in for too long. By the time the room filled, Karen's absence was as loud as her presence usually was. I stood before them, a stack of documents in my hands. For months, I've been targeted. Fines, notices, sabotage. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of you, and I can prove it. I laid out everything. Copies of bogus violations. Photos of vandalism timed perfectly with HOA notices. Emails I'd acquired that showed Karen inflating fines without board approval. And finally, the trump card. Property records that confirmed not only was my land outside HOA jurisdiction, but large portions of the valley, land under many of their homes, were legally still tied to my deed. The room buzzed with disbelief, then outrage. Faces hardened. The fear that had hung over the community for years was cracking, and through it, anger poured in. And then, as if on cue, Karen stormed in. She hadn't been invited, but of course, she wouldn't miss the chance to reassert her dominance. She shoved the door open and stood there, lips curled, eyes darting around the room like a hawk circling prey. "What is this?" she spat. "You have no authority to hold meetings. This is against HOA policy." One neighbor shot back, "We're not here under your rules, Karen. We're here because we're tired of them." Karen's face reddened. She tried to regain control, waving her binder like a weapon. "None of this matters. He's in violation. He owes this community. And if you think waving a few papers around changes that, you're delusional." That's when I delivered the blow. I held up the certified letter, the $20,000 demand, and placed it next to a set of legal documents I'd filed days earlier. "You want to talk about authority? These are court filings. a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and abuse of power, and attached our motions to invalidate every fine issued without proper board approval, including mine, including many of yours. Gasps rippled through the room. Keran faltered, blinking fast, her confidence unraveling. Neighbors who once feared her now turned to face her with fury in their eyes. The room was no longer hers. Her face twisted, a mixture of rage and disbelief. She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed like the final crack of a gavel. For the first time in months, the valley felt lighter. The weight that had hung over us was gone. But as the neighbors turned back to me, gratitude in their eyes, I knew this wasn't the end. Keran wasn't the type to walk away quietly, and I wasn't the type to let her. Because while that night was the turning point, the moment her grip finally broke, the real battle, the one that would decide the valley's future, was still ahead. After that night, everything changed. The next morning, I walked outside expecting the same tight knot of dread I'd carried for months. But instead, the valley felt quiet. Not the kind of quiet born of fear or tension, but the kind that comes after a storm. Birds sang in the trees. Neighbors walked their dogs without darting glances over their shoulders. The spell had been broken. Keran, however, wasn't gone. Not yet. Like I knew she would, she came back swinging. Within days, the HOA's lawyer filed a countersuit against me, claiming my defamatory statements had caused emotional distress and damaged the integrity of the association. It was laughable on paper, but it proved she wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Too much of her identity, her pride, her sense of power, was bound up in controlling this valley. But unlike before, she wasn't fighting just me anymore. The neighbors she'd silenced with fear for years now stood united. Several volunteered sworn statements about her intimidation tactics. Others brought forward documents, old meeting minutes, emails, even voice recordings that exposed her manipulation in full. Piece by piece, the wall she'd built to protect herself cracked wider. The day of the hearing, Keran arrived dressed like she was attending a coronation. Pressed suit, pearl necklace. But this time, she faced not just me, but an entire valley that had decided it would never again bow to her rule.